The Russian infestation, the Russian propaganda infestation within the Republican Party is getting worse and worse and worse. And we talk about Marjorie Taylor Greene on this issue a little bit, but I wanted to expand on it because we got a recent clip when she was on Real America's Voice on the War Room, which is, I believe, Steve Bannon's podcast, if I remember correctly. She started making statements about the war in Ukraine. And the way she described it, she described the war as Russia is the great defender of Christianity, that Ukraine is declaring war on Christianity and executing priests. And it's just completely bizarre, and we need to talk about it. Let's check this out.
He's talking about, confiscating assets from the Russian people, just like you said. Well, that's pretty much illegal. They're having a lot of problems with that, and Europe does not want to do it, and that's where most of those assets are.
But number one, it isn't necessarily illegal. They're going through the legal arguments to figure it out right now. And number two, some Europeans want to do it. Other Europeans don't want to do it. I don't know why Europe is now just one entity. It depends on the European power. If you're an Eastern European power, you probably want to do a lot more. If you're a Western European power, it's a little bit different.
But let's talk about what this really is, Steve. This is a war on Christianity. The Ukrainian government is attacking Christians. The Ukrainian government is executing priests. Russia is not doing that. They're not attacking Christianity. As a matter of fact, they seem to be protecting it. So that's something else that's clear and obvious to many people that are looking closely at what's going on.
I could not put a string of words together that reeks of the ignorance that those words reek of. I don't even know where to start. First off, executing priests. What priests has Ukraine executed? Like, to be clear, an execution is you take somebody out back and you shoot them, or you inject them, or you hang them, or you torture them to death. That's like, these are executions, right? Number one, the death penalty is not in Ukraine. They don't have it. So I certainly wasn't through some legalistic process. So I would assume that this would have to have been some war crime. I do not know what priest she is referring to. Gonzalo Lira, Saint Gonzalo Lira, Saint Lira, Saint Red Pill, Saint Coach Red Pill. That can't be Coach Red Pill. I really do not know what she means by they're executing priests. I genuinely don't know. And what's particularly bizarre, and look, if somebody in chat knows of an instance, please do tell me. Because I could maybe think of like, okay, they've been fighting for like pretty heavily, largest war in Europe since World War II for a while now. I could imagine a scenario where like a priest got blown up by a shell or something, but she didn't say anything like that. I'm trying, and she said execute. She said execute. The image she drew was of Zelensky going before a firing squad with like a sword, and then with like a priest, Mr. Jesus Lover, on the wall, and then he says fire. And he says execute. So I have no clue what that's in reference to. And I try to follow Ukraine news pretty closely. I'm not I don't know everything, obviously. I can only know what I know, but I have no clue what that's in reference to. So that's the first thing. The second thing is what's ironic about that is Russia has executed priests in Ukraine. At least their militias have. And it's not even like a recent event. I mean, there have been priests that have been killed recently. Either I know there were priests that have been killed in their sleep from bombing. There have been other priests that have been disappeared, and then they're gone forever. I know the Russians just actually, literally, I think it was earlier today or a few days ago, they arrested, what was his name? Here he is. They arrested an 86-year-old we'll Victor. We'll just go by Victor because that last name has a lot of V's. Why were they arresting this guy? Because he openly talked about the blowing up of the Novokakhovka HPPP. I mean the Kakhovka HPP. And he's like, oh, this is bad. This is bad. And he wrote an article questioning the war. What is this war? And that was enough for the cops to come over and say, you discredited the armed forces by having an open conversation about the blowing up of the dam and all the people who drowned. No, you're not allowed to do that. And so they went and arrested this man of God. He is not the only priest to be arrested in Russia. Other priests have been arrested in Russia for pacifist activities as well. So, I mean, defender of Christianity? Why would Jesus, the Prince of Peace, want this man in a jail cell? And how does that help Christianity? Also, like, we could go back even further. We don't even need to talk about the last 2.5 years where priests have died, priests have been disappeared, etc. And we're just talking about Christian priests. We're not even talking about Muslims in Crimea, like the Tatar community, who has had a lot of their religious figures disappear, has had a lot of their activists disappear, and they'll just show up like floating down the river weeks later. But if we go back, I mean, my friend Bogdan got displaced from Donetsk because the Russian army invaded, and then they started putting military bases in all of the Protestant churches. Yes, that's a real thing that happened. The Russians invaded the Donetsk region, and then they took over the Protestant churches, and they installed military bases on them, leading to a mass displacement of Protestants from occupied Donetsk. I think it was the Russian Orthodox Army was notorious for committing war crimes against religious minorities. And when I say religious minorities, I don't just mean people who are not Christian. I just mean other Christian denominations that don't happen to be Russian Orthodox. And by the way, Marjorie Taylor Greene is not Russian Orthodox. As far as I know, she doesn't believe that the only way to heaven is through the Russian Orthodox Church. So, I mean, is she a Protestant? Does she have Protestant residents? Do their voices matter? Do Protestant voices matter? What about Catholics? Now, I have more experience with the Protestant community in Ukraine than the Catholic community in Ukraine, so I can speak from that more. But they are very unhappy with the Russian occupation. And the Russian government has not treated them well. But we can get worse. Let's talk about what this man posted. I actually wanted to get this guy on stream to talk about a book he's releasing, and I think we might in the near future. But he brought up a story from the Russian Orthodox Army, which was notorious again for its war crimes against other Christians and religious minorities. This is him responding directly to Marjorie Taylor Greene, talking about this very issue. Hello, at Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene. As a reminder who truly persecutes Christians in Ukraine, here is a story of 4 young evangelicals from Ukraine. Their names were Victor, Vladimir, Albert, and Reuven. They died a martyr death by the hands of the Russian Orthodox Army after Russia invaded the Donbass in 2014. They were arrested on a Trinity Sunday in front of their families after leaving their house of prayer. In the jail where they spent their last hours, one could hear them sing hymns between tortures. On their last morning, their tormentors pretended to release them. They put them in a car and let it drive. Minutes after leaving the jail, the car exploded. One of them died instantly from the explosion. One burnt alive trying to get out of the car. One could get out and was shot in the face 6 times. One was shot but could escape. He bled to death soon after. All were buried in a collective grave, found when the Ukrainians traced the Russians away from Slovansk back during the ATO, the anti-terrorism operation, for more context. They had wives and children. They loved God and Ukraine. Evangelicals, there are evangelicals Ukrainians. They are a religious minority in Ukraine, just like Protestants are a religious minority in Ukraine. And the Russian Orthodox Army, again, was notorious for abusing people and murdering people, not just religious minorities, but others as well. And so to say this about Russia makes me think for the first time that she might actually just be getting her talking points straight from the Kremlin. And when I say straight from the Kremlin, I mean Russian government, I mean Russian officials, I mean like going to RT and reading RT, going to Russian government press statements, just reading those and taking them at face value. I legitimately can't tell anymore, because this idea of Russia as a defender of the Christian world is the Russian state position. The idea of Russia as the martyr of Christianity, fighting against the degeneracy before this Russian idea was formed in the 18th century and 19th century, and it was pushing back against the dirty values of the Enlightenment. And today, it's the woke, it's the liberalisms, it's the LGBT extremism, so they can raid all the gay clubs and such, and arrest the people who are openly gay and openly happy. This idea is being used as a weapon to say that they are the defenders of Christianity as they blow up hundred of year old churches that have real history in Ukraine. In some instances, we're talking about churches that are not like, oh, it's like 100, 200. We're talking about like 500, 600, 700 year old churches blowing up. Is that the work of God? Is that God's work? Is it God's work to murder evangelicals? Is it God's work to displace Protestants? Look, I am not a particularly religious man anymore. It's something that has left me, especially through my time in Ukraine as well. Even though I was surrounded by religious people, I think I took different lessons from the things that I saw. But I was still raised Protestant. I still, live in a community that is mostly Protestant. I have Protestant friends. I still have sympathy for, Protestants. How can she have not researched any of this? How could she have not done anything to do just a quick Google search for religious persecution in occupied territory? But she didn't. She didn't. She never fact-checked anything. But you really start to question, who is she loyal to? Who is Marjorie loyal to when this is the type of stuff she's saying? It very well could just be garbage being regurgitated on social media that she takes at face value, which is my number one suspect. But when you're getting this close to just promoting the Russian idea, when she's previously said the Ukrainian government was harvesting the babies, harvesting organs from babies to fund the war effort, like, there is no difference between her and Russian state commentator at this point. She could be a commentator on RT in the domestic Russia space, and I think she'd do quite well. I'm not the only person that's calling this type of stuff up, that's seeing this type of stuff. Republicans are seeing this type of stuff, and she's getting the nickname Moscow Marjorie. Moscow Marjorie. That's the name, by the way. We're traveling with that going forward. This is from The Guardian. Republicans accuse Greene of irresponsible Ukraine rhetoric. Former Congressman Ken Buck says Marjorie Taylor Greene gets her talking points from the Kremlin when opposing Ukraine aid. My experience with Marjorie is people have talked to her about not filing articles of impeachment on President Biden before he was sworn into office, not filing articles of impeachment that were groundless based on whether individuals in the Biden administration, said Ken Buck, a Colorado right-winger who left Congress last month. She was never moved by that. She was always focused on her social media account. And Moscow Marjorie is focused now on this Ukraine issue and getting her talking points from the Kremlin and making sure she is popular and she is getting a lot of coverage. Now, Ken Buck is resigning, or I think is about to resign or has resigned from Congress at this point. He was a pro-Ukraine Republican, and he was vocally critical of the attempt to oust Kevin McCarthy, the chaos that followed, and critical of Marjorie Taylor Greene. But now that he's out, he doesn't have a filter. And so now he's being a lot more open that he thinks that she's getting her talking points from the Kremlin. And we've already covered this before. Yesterday, we were watching another Republican, a powerful chairman, saying that there are people within the party that are regurgitating Russian state propaganda on the House floor. This isn't just restricted to podcasts. This isn't just restricted to weird TV appearances on niche networks. This is also making its way into the halls of the most powerful institution in the world, the United States Congress. Now look, Marjorie Taylor Greene is one person, but if you don't think that this type of rhetoric influences the base, and then the base has an influence on the politicians, and it circles and it circles and it circles, if there is a vacuum that these ignorant populists can jump into in order to either profit or build their social media following, build their profile through this creation of disinformation, if they're able to create a market for this, then people will try to serve that market, even if it's not the right thing to do, even if it's based in lies, even if it's nonsensical, even if it makes zero sense. And you can't make sense of nonsense. At this point, there are just Russian state propagandists within the Republican Party. And with a 1-seat majority, that means Russian propagandists within the Republican Party could recall the speaker. And she's already threatened to. She is the person holding Ukraine aid hostage right now. The person that is delaying Ukraine aid is the same person who thinks that Russia is fighting for Christianity and Ukraine is harvesting the organs of babies. How do you create cohesive, coherent foreign policy with these type of people anywhere near the helm of the Republican Party? And as much as we like to say, she's not the leadership, Mike Johnson listens to her quite a lot.